The restaurant lights cast soft reflections on the wine glass as she gestured with a nervous smile, trying to appear natural. He was sitting across from her, a man I had never seen before. The table they occupied was our favorite, where we celebrated birthdays, planned trips and discussed our dreams. That sight was a punch in the gut, and for a moment, I thought my heart was going to stop. I took a deep breath, gaining the courage to cross the room. Each step seemed to weigh a ton, as the hum of conversations and the clatter of cutlery mixed with the deafening noise of betrayal echoing in my mind. When I got to the table, she saw me. Her face froze, her eyes widened with terror, and her breathing visibly quickened. He also seemed surprised, but not in a guilty way, but in a calculating way, as if he was waiting to gauge my reaction. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, trying to compose herself, but her voice was shaking. I didn't need to answer. Everything was too clear. The restaurant, which was once the scene of our happiest moments, now became the scene of a grotesque spectacle of betrayal. She hurriedly stood up, knocking over her chair. "It's not what it seems." The cliched excuse made me laugh, a bitter, pain-filled laugh. My gaze flickered between her and him. The man was younger, elegant, and the way he remained calm irritated me even more. "Oh, isn't it? So what is it?" The words were filled with sarcasm, but inside me chaos was brewing. She tried to hold my hand, but I pulled away. "Please listen to me." That please sounded as empty as the promises I knew were coming. "You know everything, don't you?" she asked with tears in her eyes. "Of course I know," I replied, my icy tone reflecting the ice now taking hold in my chest. He, until then silent, decided to speak out. "I think we can resolve this in a civilized manner," he said, as if it were just a business negotiation. That was the last straw. My hand shook with the urge to punch him right then and there, but I stopped myself. "Civilized? You take my place at the table and still want civility? Maybe you should have thought about that before bringing my wife here." She began to cry, stammering disjointed explanations. "It was a mistake, I never wanted to hurt you, but I felt so lost." Her words were drowned out by the sound of memories flooding my mind, the years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights building our life together, everything thrown in the trash because of that stranger who now looked at me as if I were the victim in the story. "You think you know everything, but you know nothing," she said, trying to turn the tables, as if there was something that justified that. The cynicism was revolting. "I know enough," I replied, my eyes fixed on hers, searching for some spark of true regret, but finding only despair at being caught. "And I'll find out the rest," I added, before turning my back and leaving the restaurant, leaving them alone in that sea of awkward silence. On the way home, my head was racing. Every detail of that night felt like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The smell of the wine, the glow of the candles, the muffled laughter from the other tables, all were a cruel reminder of what I had just witnessed. The tears began to flow, but with them came a grim determination. It wouldn't stay that way. It couldn't stay like this. Her messages started arriving before I even walked through the front door. "Please listen to me, I can explain, I love you." All ignored. I threw myself on the couch, looking at the ceiling as emptiness took over. But then, something started to change inside me. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something that burned like an uncontrollable fire. Her betrayal had been a mistake she could never erase, but the consequences were yet to come. I picked up my phone and started writing down everything I needed to do. Did she want to play with fire? Well, now she and that man would feel the flames. Their world was about to fall apart, and I would be the architect of the ruin. But there was one thing I needed to do before anything else. Returning to the restaurant the next day, to talk to someone who knew everything. Because there was something she hadn't told him. And I was going to find out. Curiosity burned stronger than anything else. Who was that man? Why that place? And what else was she hiding? A part of me wanted to give up, forget everything and start again, but the other, the most hurt, knew that only the truth would give me peace. Even if she was crueler than I could imagine. Welcome to the channel where we uncover the devastating impacts of betrayal. Here, we never support or justify any form of infidelity. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a real lesson. Betrayal not only destroys relationships, it erodes lives and trust. Get ready, because what comes next is an intense narrative full of twists and turns. Take a deep breath and be ready for a shocking story that will stir your emotions. Good story. In the heat of a quiet afternoon, Ethan adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, a gesture that had become routine in his years of working in the office. He was methodical, almost predictable, and his life followed a pattern that many would call stable. Beside him, Olivia, his wife, was finishing putting on her earrings while watching him in the mirror. There was something comforting about Ethan's serenity, the way he organized every detail, as if he wanted to ensure that nothing in the world could get out of control. Olivia, on the other hand, was a woman with a restless spirit, with eyes that always searched for something beyond what was in front of her, something that, often, even she couldn't define. Ethan and Olivia's marriage was seen as an example by many. Friends commented on how they complemented each other, he, the dedicated planner, and she, the spontaneous soul who brought lightness to their days. But, like any couple, they had their differences. Olivia felt that sometimes Ethan's predictability held her back, while he felt that her thirst for novelty threatened the stability he valued so much. However, these disagreements rarely turned into arguments. They swallowed them, camouflaged them with smiles at dinners with friends and with ready-made phrases that filled the silences of everyday life. The house they lived in was a reflection of this duality. A mix of elegant furniture chosen by Ethan, always aligned and impeccable, and artistic touches that Olivia added at random, like the paintings she hung on the walls or the flower vases she insisted on buying every week. That house was a refuge, but also a silent prison for both of them. The decorative details were not enough to fill the void that sometimes hovered in the rooms, like a discreet but constant shadow. Ethan worked as a manager at a technology company, a position that required long hours of concentration and a lot of travel. He enjoyed what he did, even though work often took him away from home. Olivia's lonely nights, while he attended meetings or answered emails, were often filled with books and wine that she opened alone in the kitchen. On the other hand, Olivia was a freelance photographer, a job that allowed her to explore her creativity but also left plenty of time for thoughts she'd rather avoid. The two met at a corporate event. Olivia was taking photos for the magazine of the company where Ethan worked at the time. He, attracted by her spontaneity, made the first move, something rare in his reserved personality. She liked the security he seemed to offer, a firm harbor amid the uncertainties that always surrounded her. The relationship was quick and intense, and the wedding came in less than 2 years. It was as if they were both searching for something they believed they had found in each other, although in retrospect this certainty seemed more like a necessity than a conscious choice. Over time, however, passion gave way to routine. Ethan was getting deeper and deeper into his work, while Olivia felt like her days were becoming too predictable. The love was still there, but it carried the weight of all the unmet expectations, of individual dreams that fell along the way. They rarely talked about it. There was an implicit agreement that it was better to keep up appearances than face uncomfortable truths that could destabilize the fragile balance they had built. One day, while Ethan was at work, Olivia decided to visit a local art gallery. She loved these escapes, moments when she could lose herself in the colors and shapes of paintings that seemed to speak directly to her inner concerns. While walking through the gallery's corridors, she came across an installation that left her immobile. It was a series of black and white photographs, capturing intimate moments between strangers. There was something about the captured expressions that awakened something inside her, a desire to rediscover what she had lost to time. When Ethan returned home that night, he found Olivia more introspective than usual. She was on the balcony, with a glass of wine in her hand, looking at the sky as if looking for answers in the stars. He approached, but hesitated before saying anything. They had learned to respect each other's silences, although they both knew that these silences actually hid words that would never be said. As the days went by, that distant look from Olivia became more frequent, and Ethan began to notice. He tried to start a conversation, but his questions were always practical, never getting to the heart of what she really felt. Olivia, on the other hand, avoided talking about her thoughts, as if she was afraid that putting them into words would make them too real. They were together, but there was a growing distance between them, an invisible rift that they both pretended not to notice. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Ethan prepared a special dinner at home. He had booked their favorite restaurant, but Olivia said she preferred something more intimate. As he cooked, he remembered how they used to laugh together in the kitchen in the early years of their marriage. He felt a pang of longing for something that was still there, but somehow seemed out of reach. Olivia tried to participate in the moment, but her smile didn't reach her eyes, and Ethan noticed. After dinner, while Olivia cleaned the table, Ethan watched. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. The feeling that something was wrong consumed him, but he didn't know how to start that conversation. Olivia, in turn, felt a growing guilt. She didn't know exactly why, but there was an uneasiness inside her that she couldn't ignore. The following days passed as usual, but the atmosphere was different. Ethan immersed himself in work, perhaps as a way to avoid facing reality at home. Olivia, on the other hand, started going out more often, saying she needed inspiration for new photography projects. Ethan believed it, or at least wanted to believe it. It was easier that way. What neither of them knew was that this seemingly harmless dynamic was about to trigger events that would change their lives forever. The rift that had been slowly forming was about to become an abyss, and none of them were prepared for what came next. The days continued with a routine that seemed as solid as it was fragile. Ethan remained immersed in work, his hours divided between meetings and reports, while Olivia explored her creative world, stepping out frequently to capture images that she said represented human emotions in their rawest form. But something in the air was starting to change. There was a silent tension, a restlessness that Ethan couldn't name but felt with every fiber of his being. It was as if the world around him, once so familiar, had begun to crumble into small, imperceptible cracks. Olivia seemed more and more distant. She would leave in the morning with her camera and return late, with a tiredness that, instead of being physical, seemed emotional. When Ethan asked her about her day, she offered vague, almost automatic answers that didn't match the enthusiasm she usually had when talking about photography. He tried not to insist. I thought it was just a phase, that she needed space, but the feeling of something wrong remained like a shadow. One night, while Olivia was in the shower, her cell phone vibrated on the living room table. Ethan, distracted by the sound, looked over reflexively. It was a message. Just a short line, but it carried a weight he hadn't expected. I'm counting down the minutes until I see you again. The message disappeared from the screen before he could fully process it, but it hit him like a blow to the chest. He felt the blood leave his face as his heart hammered in his chest. A part of him wanted to believe it was a mistake, that maybe it was something related to her work, but deep down he knew it wasn't. Ethan tried to act normal as they ate dinner, but the words on the screen kept echoing in his mind. Olivia noticed his silence but didn't ask anything, perhaps relieved that he wasn't questioning the changes that she also knew were obvious. After dinner, while she went up to her room, Ethan remained in the living room, staring into space, his mind spinning in a whirlwind of thoughts. He wanted to confront her, but at the same time he feared the answer. The doubt was unbearable, but the possibility of confirmation seemed even worse. The following days were torture. Ethan began to observe Olivia's movements more closely, noticing small details that had previously gone unnoticed. She was more careful about her appearance, spent more time on her cell phone, often laughing softly at messages he couldn't see. With every smile she smiled, a piece of his confidence was ripped away, leaving a void he didn't know how to fill. One night, While Olivia was sleeping, Ethan gave in to the temptation to check her cell phone. He hesitated for long minutes, holding the device in his hands, feeling like he was invading something that should be sacred, but the need to know was greater. What he found was devastating. Exchanges of messages with a man whose name he had never heard, full of words that he didn't know if he hated more for the intimacy or the joy they conveyed. Ethan felt as if he had been struck, as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. The next morning, as Olivia walked out with the camera slung over her shoulder and a nervous smile, Ethan decided he needed answers. He followed her discreetly, feeling like a stranger in his own life, an intruder in a world he thought he knew. She walked through the streets with firm steps, without realizing she was being watched, until she entered a cafe they used to frequent together. Ethan stood outside, watching through the window as she sat at a table and, minutes later, a man joined her. They laughed, leaning towards each other, hands occasionally touching on the table. Ethan wanted to enter that cafe at that moment, he wanted to confront them, shout, demand explanations, but something stopped him. He stood there, watching, as if he needed to see more, as if it would help him understand what had happened to the woman he thought he knew so well. Their every gesture was a stab, every laugh a reminder of everything they had lost, everything that had been taken from him without warning. When Olivia returned home that night, Ethan tried to act normal, but the facade was beginning to crumble. He could barely look at her without feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. Her every word seemed loaded with falsehood, and he began to realize how difficult it was to pretend he didn't know. He wanted to believe there was still something to save, but the pain was overwhelming. He was caught between the desire to preserve what was left of their life together and the need to face the truth. Finally, the betrayal came to light. One night, while they were at the restaurant that had always been special to them, Ethan could no longer hold the silence. He watched Olivia from across the table, her smile forced, her hands restless. He knew she was lying, but the sound of her lies was almost unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was an undertone of pain that he couldn't hide. "Who were you with today?" he asked, breaking the silence so abruptly that Olivia almost dropped her wine glass. Her gaze froze for a moment before recovering. "What do you mean?" she replied, her voice shaking slightly. Ethan didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of the question hang in the air. He watched her, waiting for her to confess, to say something that could explain the inexplicable, but she just looked away. "I know everything," he said finally, and those words seemed to fill the space between them like thunder. Olivia fell silent, her hands shaking on the table, unable to meet his eyes. He didn't need to say anything else. Her silence was the confirmation he feared, and at that moment, everything seemed to fall apart. Ethan felt anger mixed with overwhelming sadness, while Olivia, for the first time, seemed to realize the extent of the damage she had caused. The confrontation between them was inevitable, but Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. The betrayal was showing, but there was still something behind it, something he still didn't fully understand. He knew he needed answers, but he also knew that those answers could be even more painful than he imagined. The silence in the room was heavy, almost palpable. Ethan was standing in the center, arms crossed, while Olivia curled up on the couch, eyes fixed on the floor. The sound of the clock on the wall was the only thing that moved in that space frozen by tension. After the confrontation at the restaurant, she knew she could no longer run away. He knew, and denial was futile. However, what Ethan didn't know, and what Olivia deeply feared revealing, was the true extent of what was happening. "Can you at least try to explain?" Ethan finally said, his voice low but filled with suppressed anger. Olivia looked up at him, her lips quivering. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, as if she knew that any wrong sentence could break him further. "It wasn't planned," he began, but Ethan laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh. "Wasn't it planned?" he repeated, crossing the room in slow, deliberate steps. "Is that all you have to say? Because honestly, it seems really well orchestrated for something that wasn't planned." "I don't know what you want me to say," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I want you to tell the truth, Olivia. The whole truth. Not just what you think will hurt me the least, but everything. No lies, no excuses. Ethan was standing before her now, his eyes boring into hers, and Olivia felt a lump form in her throat. She knew this moment would come, but facing it was a pain she could never have imagined. I met him at an event, he began, hesitantly, as Ethan clenched his fists at his sides. He was charismatic, fun, something I hadn't felt in a long time. At first, it was just talk, nothing much, but, over time, things changed. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, as if trying to absorb the words without exploding. And you decided this was more important than us? More important than everything we've built together, he asked, his voice cracking slightly at the end. It wasn't like that, Ethan. I didn't want to destroy anything. I lost myself in the process. I thought. Olivia trailed off, the words escaping her as tears began to stream down her face. Ethan pulled away, running his hands through his hair, trying to contain the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. What did you think, Olivia? That there would be no consequences? That I would never find out? Or did you just not care enough to think about it? The question hung in the air, and Olivia knew she needed to say something more, but there was another layer, something even darker that she needed to reveal. She knew she couldn't keep it hidden any longer. Ethan, she began, her voice carrying a weight he didn't yet understand. There's one more thing you need to know. He stopped moving, his expression changing from anger to a mixture of suspicion and anticipation. What? He asked, every muscle in his body tense. Olivia hesitated, her eyes fixed on him as she tried to find the strength to say what needed to be said. He wasn't just with me, Ethan. He was also using all of this to get at you. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan blinked a few times, trying to process the words, before taking a step forward. What are you saying? That this wasn't just a betrayal? That it was something more than that? Olivia nodded slowly, the tears falling faster now. He knew who you were, Ethan. He knew about your position, your company. He approached me with a purpose. Ethan felt the world spin. It wasn't just an emotional betrayal, it was a calculated attack, a manipulation of everything he valued. So you were a tool, he said, his voice growing colder with each word. You were used, Olivia, and you didn't even realize it. She shook her head, her pain evident. I realized too late, Ethan. I realized when I was already too trapped to get out without hurting you even more. Her words swirled in Ethan's mind, each one like a blade. He felt the anger rising again, but there was something deeper, something he couldn't name. He wanted to scream, wanted to break something, but instead he stood there, looking at her as if he were seeing a stranger. You destroyed everything, Olivia. Everything. And for what? For someone who never cared about you, who only wanted to get to me. How could you be so blind? I know I was wrong, Olivia replied, her voice full of desperation. But I never wanted it to be like this. I never wanted to hurt you. Ethan shook his head, laughing again, but this time it was a hopeless laugh. Well, congratulations, Olivia. You did it. He turned, walking to the door, but stopped before leaving. This isn't over, Olivia. I'm going to find out every detail of this story. And when I know everything, you and he will pay for it. The door closed with a bang, leaving Olivia alone in the room, her sobs echoing in the void. She knew Ethan was serious. He wasn't the type to leave things unfinished. And as she sat there, wrapped in guilt and regret, she knew the worst was yet to come. Ethan would seek the truth, and the truth, when revealed, would have an impact neither of them could predict. Ethan left the house with quick steps and his mind was in a whirlwind. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as he tried to organize the thoughts that were intertwining in his mind. Olivia's revelation had reconfigured everything. It wasn't just an emotional betrayal, but a calculated manipulation, a direct attack not only on his marriage but also on his professional life. He felt like he was in free fall, unable to hold on to anything that would give him stability. As he drove down the deserted road, he decided he needed answers and, more than that, he needed to act. He parked the car in the parking lot of a small hotel and entered without thinking. The receptionist barely noticed his presence as he headed to the room he had quickly booked on his cell phone. As soon as he entered, he threw the keys on the nightstand and threw himself on the bed, but sleep didn't come. Olivia's words echoed in her mind, each syllable pulsing like a throbbing pain. Who was this man who dared to play with her life? Ethan knew that to understand the plan, he needed to face the problem head-on, even if it meant going back to the pain of every detail. The next morning he began his search. Ethan hired a private investigator, an experienced man who had dealt with similar situations before. Sitting in a discreet cafe, Ethan handed over the information he had about Olivia's lover, including the messages he had seen and the details he had managed to extract from his wife during their argument. The investigator nodded silently, writing everything down in a worn notebook. "I'll find out what's behind this," he said firmly. Ethan just shook his head, still looking distant. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and expectations. Olivia tried to get in touch, sending messages and calling incessantly, but Ethan wasn't answering. He needed space, time to understand what to do with all the pieces that were now accumulating in his hands. However, that didn't stop the weight of betrayal from hitting him at random times. A sound, a smell, a shared memory, it was all a cruel reminder of what he had lost. A week later, the investigator called. The voice on the other end was firm, almost urgent. "I found something. We need to meet." Ethan agreed, arranging to meet at the same discreet cafe. When he arrived, he found the investigator already sitting, a thick envelope on the table. "The man your wife became involved with is more than just an intruder in your personal life," he began, slipping the envelope to Ethan. "He has a history of manipulation and extortion. The target in this case was not just you, but your company." Ethan opened the envelope with shaking hands. The photos and documents he found there revealed an intricate scheme. The man was linked to a corporate espionage network, specialized in destroying reputations and stealing sensitive information from competing companies. He used intimate relationships to infiltrate the personal lives of executives, destabilizing them and, ultimately, gaining access to corporate secrets. Ethan felt his stomach drop as he analyzed each page. He now understood that this wasn't just a matter of marital betrayal, it was a direct attack on everything he had built. "He used Olivia to get to you," the investigator continued. "The conversations they had, the meetings, everything was designed to extract information that could be used against you and your company. Fortunately, as far as I could tell, he was not successful in accessing critical information, but that doesn't mean the damage has been done." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to process what he was hearing. Anger was building inside him, but now it was mixed with something else, a fierce determination not to let this go unpunished. He needed to confront this man. "I needed to understand where this had gone." "Can you locate him?" he asked the investigator, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. The man nodded. "I have an address. But before you do anything, I suggest you think about the consequences. This isn't just personal. It's a legal matter, and any rash move could complicate things." But Ethan had already made his decision. He could no longer wait, could no longer live with doubt gnawing at his every thought. That night, he drove to the address provided by the investigator. It was a small, discreet restaurant, where the man used to meet his conquests, according to the information. Ethan parked the car across the street and waited, his mind racing with scenarios of how this could play out. A short time later, he saw him. The man entered the restaurant, carefree, as if nothing in the world could touch him. Ethan felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to remain calm. He entered the restaurant, taking a deep breath as he walked to the table where the man was sitting. When he finally looked up, he looked confused for a moment, but quickly gave a sarcastic smile. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice full of cynicism. Ethan leaned forward, resting his hands on the table as he looked directly into his eyes. "You know who I am," Ethan said, his voice low but full of intensity. The man didn't respond right away, but the smile didn't disappear. "Ah, yes. The husband. We finally met." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to contain the anger that threatened to explode. "What do you want?" he asked, each word heavy with the pain and indignation he carried. "Don't take it personally," the man replied, his tone casual as if they were discussing the weather. "That's just business." But for Ethan, there was nothing impersonal about it. He knew that for this man, he was just another name on a long list of targets, but for Ethan, that was everything. His life, his confidence, his stability, it had all been destroyed because of a cold, calculated plan. "Business?" Ethan repeated, his voice becoming firmer. "You destroyed my marriage, tried to ruin my career, and you have the audacity to call it business?" The man shrugged, clearly unconcerned. "You're exaggerating. Your marriage was already broken. I just used the pieces you left hanging." His words were the spark Ethan needed. He leaned in even closer, his voice low but charged with menace. "This isn't over. I'm going to make sure you pay for all of this, every detail, every lie. You think you came out on top, but you're about to find out you picked the wrong target." The man maintained his smile, but there was something in his eyes that indicated slight concern. Ethan turned and left the restaurant, his mind already formulating his next steps. He knew that this confrontation was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would require all of his strength and intelligence to overcome. As he drove home, he felt for the first time a spark of control over the situation, a small flame of hope that, despite everything, he could rebuild what had been destroyed. But he also knew that the road would be long, and that the true consequences of that night were yet to come. The living room of the apartment where Ethan had taken refuge was plunged into an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional sound of his footsteps as he paced back and forth, deep in thought. The encounter with the man in the restaurant had been a turning point. He had confronted whoever was responsible for disrupting his life, but instead of feeling relief, what consumed him now was a mixture of restlessness and doubt. Ethan knew that simply showing his determination wasn't enough. He wanted more. He needed justice, but he also needed to find out how far he was willing to go to get it. The man's words echoed in her mind, especially the cruel assertion that the marriage was already broken before he entered the equation. It hit him in a way he didn't expect. Was it true? Had he ignored the signs for so long that he had become complacent, allowing the distance between him and Olivia to widen? As much as he wanted to deny it, Ethan knew that something had changed a long time ago, but he never had the courage to face reality. Olivia's betrayal was a stab, but perhaps the greatest pain came from the realization that he had also contributed, even if unconsciously, to the void that separated them. Despite everything, the predominant feeling was one of determination. He needed to act, needed to make sure that this man and everyone involved in his scheme paid for what they had done. Ethan spent the next few days meeting with lawyers and security experts, ensuring that all holes in the company were closed. He knew that any mistake could be used against him, and now more than ever, he couldn't afford to make a mistake. His team, previously unaware of the more personal details of the case, noticed his renewed intensity. He threw himself into his work with a ferocity that many interpreted as strength, but which was actually a way of drowning out the emotional turmoil that consumed him. Meanwhile, Olivia was desperately trying to reconnect with him. The messages she sent daily were long and emotional, full of regret and pleading. She wanted to talk, explain more than she had already said, but Ethan couldn't even open those messages without feeling a wave of anger and sadness. He knew that he would eventually need to confront her again, but for now, he preferred to keep his distance. There was a part of him that still felt something for her, something he couldn't completely erase, but the weight of betrayal overshadowed any possibility of reconciliation at that moment. One day, while in the office reviewing the security team's latest reports, Ethan received a call from the private investigator. He had managed to track down more information about the past of the man who became involved with Olivia and, more importantly, about his connection to other similar schemes. The investigator explained that he had already claimed victims before, using similar methods to destabilize other executives. But there was one detail Ethan hadn't expected: one of the previous victims had managed to turn the tables and publicly expose the scheme, temporarily ruining the man's reputation. The investigator suggested that Ethan consider doing the same, but warned that doing so would require courage and a willingness to face possible legal and personal consequences. Ethan thought deeply about what he should do. Publicly exposing the man would also mean exposing himself and Olivia. He knew the media would love to turn his story into a spectacle, and that was something he wasn't sure he was willing to put up with. However, the thought of simply letting it go was also unbearable. He was trapped in a complex moral dilemma: fight for justice and risk losing even more, or protect what little he had left and try to rebuild his life away from the spotlight. Determined to find a solution that wouldn't completely compromise his privacy, Ethan met again with the investigator and his lawyers. They devised a plan that involved collecting enough evidence to incriminate the man and turning it over to the authorities, ensuring that he would be held accountable without Ethan needing to expose himself any more than necessary. It was a risky plan, but it was the best option they had. Ethan knew it would be a long process and would require patience, but he was willing to move forward. As he worked to execute the plan, Ethan began to realize something important: his initial anger was turning into something more complex. He still felt betrayed and hurt, but there was a new clarity emerging amidst the chaos. He began to wonder if his obsession with justice was also a way of avoiding facing the deeper emotions that were surfacing. The pain of betrayal was real, but it was also a reflection of years of emotional disconnection, both with Olivia and with himself. He began to realize that in order to move forward, he would not only need to face the man who had wronged him, but also face himself. One night, while alone in his temporary apartment, Ethan finally decided to open one of Olivia's messages. She said she wanted to meet him, that she needed to explain more than she had managed the last time they talked. Reluctantly, he agreed. They arranged to meet in a discreet park, away from prying eyes. When they arrived, the tension between them was palpable. Olivia looked exhausted, as if the days since the breakup had sucked all the energy out of her. Ethan, on the other hand, was determined to maintain control. Olivia began speaking, her voice full of emotion. She talked about how guilty she felt, how she deeply regretted her choices, and how she knew she could never undo what she had done. Ethan listened silently, his eyes fixed on her but his expression impenetrable. When she finished, he took a deep breath before responding. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you," he said, his voice firm but not cruel. "But I also know that carrying this anger around forever won't help me." Olivia nodded, tears streaming down her face as she thanked him for at least being willing to listen. They talked for hours, revisiting old memories and trying to understand where things had started to fall apart. It was painful, but it was also a step towards something that neither of them knew how to define yet. It wasn't reconciliation, but it wasn't the absolute end either. It was somewhere in the middle, an uncertain place where they would both have to navigate carefully. As night fell, Ethan returned home feeling a little lighter, but still aware that the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. He knew there was still a lot to resolve, both externally and internally. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe there was a chance to rebuild something, even if it was just for himself. The moral dilemma he had faced throughout the entire situation still haunted him, but he was beginning to find clarity amid the confusion. The end was yet to come, but Ethan was determined to face it head-on. Ethan was sitting in the office of his apartment, looking out the window at the bustle of the street below. The paperwork on the table in front of him represented months of painstaking work. Every document, every email, every piece of evidence had been carefully pieced together, a puzzle that was now complete. The case against the man who tried to destroy his personal and professional life was about to begin. Ethan knew the battle wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had control. The investigations by the lawyer and the private investigator had proven incredibly valuable. Not only would the man be prosecuted, but he would also face justice for other fraudulent schemes that had come to light during the case. The next morning, Ethan went to court to deliver the final documents. There was something symbolic about that act, as if each leaf was a piece of himself that he was recovering. He didn't go to Olivia to tell her about this stage of the process. Even though they had talked in the park, and she had shown genuine remorse, Ethan knew their chapter was closed. He needed to move forward without the weight of the past, and that included learning to live without her. Meanwhile, Olivia faced the consequences of her choices. After meeting Ethan, she decided it was time to reevaluate her life. She moved to a small apartment, far from the house they shared, and began attending therapy to understand what had led her to act the way she did. She knew she would never get back what she lost, but she was determined to at least try to become someone better. The nights were lonely and the days were long, but Olivia began to find small moments of peace in the photographs she took and in the volunteer work she began doing with an organization that helped women in difficult situations. It was a beginning, albeit a late one, and she knew that Ethan's forgiveness, if it ever came, would not be something she hoped for like an absolution, but something only he could decide when he was ready. The man who had started all the devastation did not escape unscathed. After being formally prosecuted, the fraudulent schemes he ran were exposed. Aggrieved companies began filing lawsuits against him, and his reputation, once built on charm and manipulation, was completely destroyed. He lost access to any power he had and was forced to face justice for his actions. In a public trial that attracted considerable attention, he tried to defend himself, but the evidence was irrefutable. The sentence was harsh, and he knew he wouldn't have the chance to start over anytime soon. For him, the fall was quick, but the impact would be lasting. As the months passed, Ethan began to rebuild his life. He sold the house where so many memories were imbued and bought an apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a place he could truly call a new beginning. His career was thriving, but he made significant changes to prioritize his well-being. He reduced his workload, hired trusted people to help him manage the company, and began giving himself time to explore hobbies he had long put aside. It was on one of these explorations that he met someone unexpected. During a cooking class he had decided to take at the insistence of a colleague, Ethan met Claire, a woman with an easy laugh and patience that seemed infinite. The connection between them was natural, unhurried, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a different future. Olivia, in turn, heard about Ethan and Claire through a mutual friend. The news hit her bittersweet. She was happy that he had found someone who could bring back the joy she had taken away, but the memory of what she lost was inevitable. Still, she accepted it as part of the price she needed to pay for her choices. She didn't look for Ethan, and he didn't look for her either. The distance between them was now permanent, but there was a quiet peace in knowing that they were both trying to move forward, in their own way. The months turned into years, and the chaos that once defined the lives of everyone involved became just a distant memory. Ethan found balance, a mix of professional success and personal happiness that he didn't believe was possible during the worst of times. Olivia continued her journey of self-discovery, living a simpler but more meaningful life than she had ever had before. The man who tried to destroy them was forgotten, trapped in his own web of mistakes and manipulations. The story that began with betrayal and pain found a transformative ending. Not all wounds were healed, but the scars served as reminders of strength, resilience, and the ability to rebuild even after the darkest moments. Ethan, Olivia, and even the others involved have learned that the path to redemption, or at least peace, is often longer and more painful than we imagine, but always possible. And so ends this intense story full of twists and turns. If you've made it this far, comment what you think. Your opinion is very important to us. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, the channel does not support any type of cheating. These narratives are created to show how choices can destroy lives and how the search for redemption and overcoming can be transformative. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.